Yes, so this is our third session in our April cycle of Global Academy of Conscious Politics. And I'm very, very happy I can welcome our expert on lobbying and a great friend of mine and an amazing Italian and European, Andrea Boccuni, with us, who is great in citizen lobbying, who has a passion to help people to pursue their ideas in the world of politics, in the world of civic activism. And he's a head of global partnerships or European partnerships in Good Lobby Europe. And he's been working a lot with our friend Alberto Almano, also, who you might heard about, in creating great partnerships of Good Lobby. And we've known with Andrea already for a year or almost 2 years.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it's almost 2 years. Personally and also in Dutch, and I'm so privileged. He's a mentor on our faculty of mentors of Global Academy, and he's taking on this political part as well. So Andrea, floor is yours. And I'm happy we have Abhishek with us from India, Christina now from Berlin, but originally from Bolivia, and Victoria from Ukraine. So we are going global, and we have still Andrea with us, who is Polish, living in Berlin. So Andrea is also greetings to you. And yes, and I will leave the space now for Andrea to co-create this session and go on a lobbying topics.
On a lobbying journey.
On a lobbying journey, yes.
So thank you, everyone, for having made yourself available for this. And also thank you for Andrea and for the great work that you've been doing together with the team. So again, this will be a lecture. This will be an interactive lecture. This is a small group, so we have the luxury of having interaction. I don't know how you prefer. You can write on a chat when you have questions. You can simply speak up. I mean, we will make it very interactive. I'll now share my desktop. Now, you see it? Can you all see?
Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
So, very well. So this will be a small journey into the world of European politics, into the world of how industry and associations in general perform their lobbying activity, and how that could be interesting for representative of civil society, NGO, and simply citizen. So my name is Andrea, and I am head of partnership at the Good Lobby. However, in my background and as a starting point, I'm actually a corporate lobbyist. So my experience mostly comes from private sector, not exclusively corporation, also small, medium enterprises, universities, governments, but mostly corporation. Specifically, I'm actually an agricultural expert. So I gravitate more in the agri-food health area, but I will tell you a bit more. I have experience in European institutions. Specifically, I worked as an assistant in European Parliament for a 5 stars movement, members of the European Parliament. Maybe some of you might be familiar actually with how politics unfolds in that crazy country called Italy. I think there is some interesting example to be made also from that experience. But anyway, I then went on working for the corporate sector, as I said. Then I also worked for the European Commission as a food fraud expert in DG Sante, so the Directorate General for Health and Food Safety. I am also working for a agency in the Netherlands called Hey Corporate Affairs, where we also do strategy and corporate communication. But here in this specific exercise, I'm wearing my civil society hat, meaning the work that we do with the Good Lobby. On a side, I also lecture. This mostly comes from MBA courses, such as TS in Tilburg University, the Netherlands, and a bit of Eastern European understanding of how it works, and that's American University in Bulgaria. So, what are we gonna do today? Today, we're gonna nail 3 easy points. The first one is that lobbying is just a tool. Lobbying has a very bad connotation. It comes from the image of this predatory approach that the industry normally has on regulation and legislation. But as you will see, this is simply just a tool. This tool sits on a deep and thorough understanding of the legal and administrative environment where this lobby activity takes place in. And when these tools are used or given to civil society, that can create very interesting examples and endeavors of citizen dialogue with the European institutions specifically, but more in general with the law. Now, just to break the ice, do any of you know this gentleman here? So this guy is Max Schrems. He's an Austrian lawyer. And at the age of 22, he went to study to US. At that point, he started to develop his understanding around privacy law. And he understood how Facebook was so pervasive in his almost fraudulent activities of data gathering. So then he came back to Europe and he sued Facebook on how he used European citizen data. He started and set in motion the process that then became the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. That thing that forces you to allow on cookies every time you browse on a European website. That things that keep on asking for your consent and your informed consent on online communication, spam, emails, newsletters. So the GDPR is the most thorough and rigid regulation on data in the world, so much so that now is copy-pasted by other countries. Japan and Canada are providing themselves with this kind of regulation. And it all started because this guy one day decided to sue Facebook, that is based in Ireland in Europe, so he sued to an Irish court. And then step by step forced this huge company into more and more defensive position and to accept the law. And I don't know if you have seen Mark Zuckerberg just a week ago, he just presented that now the future is privacy. So this is exactly the opposite approach that he used in the past 10 years. So regulation does work. A gentleman from Mexico, Alejandro Calvillo, is an activist in Mexico. And I also think it's a very beautiful story. Basically, some of you may be aware of that in three Mexican presidents ago, Vicente Fox was before he'd been appointed as president, he actually was a high manager from Coca-Cola. And he literally flooded the country during events, during celebration, with soft drinks. So much so that Mexico experienced a spike of more than 40% in childhood obesity, simply because of change in the consumption patterns of soft drinks in people. So just simply more Coca-Colas. And he, together with lawyers from Georgetown University, he was the first one to introduce the soda tax, which is a specific kind of taxation that creates bad incentives for companies to sell and advertise specifically to children, but more generally to society, by making this an enormous legal effort to put a tax on a product. You literally have to go against the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So this is a highly technical and yet very powerful way of interacting with institutions. To us, to the Good Lobby, they are citizen lobbyists. So citizen in their capacity, in the capacity of their organization, but mostly citizen or individuals, that by engaging in a deep understanding of laws and systems, how the system works, they can actually achieve a lot and strengthen their campaigning position. So this is to say that, in fact, lobbying is not rocket science, it's just a bunch of tools. And what if these tools were given to civil society? So what if civil society actually could have the same or even more impact than corporation? Or how could they cooperate? We live now in a more paradoxical time. The same countries that pollute the most are also the ones that invest the most in renewable energies. China. Or the companies that are damaging more the planet in terms of food supply chain and sourcing of minerals and resources in general are also the ones that have the financial means to curb this system. This is, for example, why Shell is the biggest investors in biofuels and biogases and algae, simply because they have the more money, the biggest wallet to deal with that issue. We believe that this is possible. We believe that corporations and NGOs should at least have the same tools. And how do we make sure civil society understands? Well, first and foremost, we provide legal support. So there is this big pool of lawyers, pro bono lawyers, either in their own capacity or in the capacity of organizations. For example, big law firms have mandatory pro bono requirements. And we match it with NGOs. After that, we also provide education and training, such as this very one. Now, did you know that actually only a third of NGOs in Europe actually have lawyers on staff? That's really little for the role they have to play in society. At the same time, all of them, more than 90%, do require advice in relation to law. So we wanted to test this assumption, and everywhere we go in our trainings or work, we survey NGOs. This data specifically comes from Paris. So this is a population of French NGOs of around 200 contacts, and they all said that they haven't received sufficient legal assistance in their work. That is almost 50%. As well, none of their campaign, half of those, never received pro bono advice. And that's a waste. That's literally a missed opportunity. And then we ask, what are the main obstacles for your campaign? And they always say, obviously, lack of support. The more budget, the better. But also the poor knowledge of advocacy tools, which is very, very interesting, because those organizations are the ones that represent civil society. They should have a certain understanding of advocacy simply because it matters, simply because it makes their work effective. Now, the pro bono culture comes from US. And this is mostly because in US, the legal system is very different, and the state wouldn't normally give support to its citizens. In many European countries, if you can't afford to defend yourself, a state law will be given to you. In New USA, that doesn't happen. So pro bono had to become structural in the system. And this is because the pro bono culture is so widespread in US. However, in Europe, we have a lot of US companies. And so they also implemented this culture. In UK, there's a very interesting data. If you see who spends these pro bono hours, almost half of these are managers, like top level associates or partners. So it's not even that your case will be given to the last trainee that arrived a couple of months ago. This is quality job, again, for free. This is just an extract of the UK pro bono report. These are some of the areas covered. I think consumer is a very interesting one. That's why the tax law, again, on soft drinks. Obviously, in Europe now, we have this migration situation. So there are a lot of humanitarian aid and human rights dossiers that are open on the table. So a lot of crisis response, human rights, immigration, and citizenship. So these are just examples of what you can get for free if you happen to have a project that relates to these topics. And so here with the Good Lobby, we developed a big community of citizen lobbyists. I personally bring these workshops to many European member states. Many NGOs that work with us receive this pro bono assistance. And so, yeah, this is the network that we developed. Some quick examples. We were the first one to file a European Citizen Initiative. A European Citizen Initiative is a tool that allows citizens to ask the European Commission, which is the initiators of laws in Europe, to take into consideration something, to take into consideration LGBT rights or waters or pesticide-free food, whatever. We were the first one to file a European Citizen Initiative. And that's a very interesting tool because it only requires 1 million signatures in at least 7 countries. And that's relatively simple to get. And yet it's an extremely underestimated and undermined tool. Since it was instituted, that was 2007, we only had some 30 European Citizen Initiatives, which is ridiculous. If you think how many online petitions you've seen circulating on web, these are hundreds. Another case that was very interesting, you might recognize Mr. Barroso, former president of the European Commission. There is a phenomenon in politics that is called the revolving door phenomenon. When a politician goes to the private sectors and back and so forth. And we have several big examples. Nick Clegg, former leader for the Lib Dem in UK, is now representing Facebook. The Chancellor, the last Chancellor of Germany, Schröder, is now working for Gazprom in Russia. Anyway, but also just figured that it would have been so nice to go work for Goldman Sachs immediately after his mandate expires. So we found that immoral, and so we opted for a complaint to the Secretary General of the European Union, which stopped him and prevented for a good period of time to go there. That's a difficult case. So in short, a couple of years ago, a lot of leaks on financial data proved that Luxembourg is tax heaven. We all knew, but there was a particular case because the current president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, was actually president of Luxembourg for 19 years, so he was an accused to his presidency. And that is because this guy, Antoine Deltour, a consultant from PwC, revealed how banks in Luxembourg fraud, and they do money laundering, for example. That became the LuxLeaks scandals. Well, if you do something like that, you go to jail, or companies, they will destroy you. And that's why you want a whistleblowing policy. This is why you want a policy that defends those who expose fraudulent behavior. We have a very similar example in Italy with the criminal organizations and mafia. So former affiliates, when they turn on, they are protected. We wrote, together with Transparency International, the first whistleblowing policy that was actually adopted 2 years ago. So that's a very long journey. They started 4 years ago, but now provides whistleblowing protection everywhere in Europe. Another quick example, this is from pesticide. You might remember some discussion around the use of this glyphosate, which is an active principle of Roundup, which is a product from Monsanto, so it was in the era of pesticide stuff. We helped the Green Party to have a legal assessment on how to make their case stronger. It's a beautiful case when a lawyer can really do the work. So as an organization, you have a big case and you're going against big corporations that have tons of lawyers. So the least you can do is to prepare yourself. So yeah, these are some of the organizations we helped and support. Now, before we move on, any questions so far? All good? Okay, I'll continue. Brussels stuff. Now, I know some of you might have a certain understanding of how Brussels works. That's nothing interesting. It's just bureaucracy. It's relatively boring. But something that Europe did was to be literally the most transparent political object on the planet. In terms of transparency, the quantity and quality of information available, we score the highest. Some single member states do better, but in terms of political complex, don't expect to find that in Russia, China, Ecuador, or whatever. So we're extremely transparent. Also, my work as a lobbyist is required to be trackable at any point. So every email I send, every attachment to the email that I send to European Commission or officials is recorded. Every time I meet them, I'm recorded. I have a badge. Do I have it here? No. Well, basically, I can just enter any building, and every time I do so, I am tagged. All these data are gathered in the Transparency Register, and some NGOs, Transparency International, develop some charts that explain how this works. So what you see here is lobby activities live. I will show later another tool, but basically this gives a glimpse of who actually lobbies. And how do you measure that? Well, in this specific case, it's measuring a number of meetings. So how many times the organization met officials. And here, you see there's a lot of corporation, many familiar names. So you might be tempted to consider this as the usual classic example of corporate lobbying just to prevail, which in all fairness, corporations are there because they should be there. European Commission needs their information. European Commission is just an institution, it's a bunch of people. They don't know everything at all times. So most of the information comes from the industry itself. Also because it's industry that will have to implement those laws. But also because in many ways, society is a profit thing. If you exclude universities and literally the government, anything else is for profit. 80% of the economic network of Europe is SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So corporations do play a major role, but they are less in terms of number than other groups. So here, what do we see? We see Business Europe, we see Google, we see Airbus, we see Digital Europe. But what strikes me as a lobbyist that I expect a lot of corporate power, I see 1, 2, and 3 NGOs, which is very interesting because how is it possible that WWF met as many times as Microsoft, considering the magnitude of money they have? And so this is interesting because it brings the aspect on the fact that NGOs actually are recognized. They do talk with politicians. They are having many, many meetings. So they should be as well good. They should be professional and sufficiently informed to be able to actually support policymaking. On the other side, industry will always be industry. So if I know they have Google, and by the way, we're doing a lot of privacy law in Europe at this point. So I would expect a lot of tech lobby happening. And then we just passed the e-privacy directive. We passed the general data protection regulation, the cookie law. So I would expect that happening. So if I have Google that is making lobbying activities, I also know that Google is member of Business Europe, is also a member of Digital Europe, is also a member of the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU. And so that brings back again on the NGO sector. Is business overrepresented? No, it's the other way around. Civil society is underrepresented. So business will be there anyway. So what civil society can do is to catch up by using the same tools. Now, I just want to see if I can show you this. Can you all see this website that I'm showing? So this is the actual tool. He has changed a bit. It's better now. And this gives us a lot of information on the meetings that lobbyists had with institutions, with the lobbyists themselves. They gives you information on the members of the European Parliament's salary and stuff. So you see that the situation is still very similar. So we see a lot of digital lobbying. Facebook is back again. And we see a lot of lobbying activity. Now, what do these meetings are about? So every meeting is tagged. So they will have to have a certain tag name. And that is the aggregate data of the subject of meetings with institutions. And I think it's a very interesting graph because you see a lot of words, but you might also understand that you see words that should be there. In the meetings with those officials, here I don't see the word Brexit, or I don't see the word migrants, or I don't see the word, I don't know, army, or Turkey, or Russia. So this is also sets another kind of scenario where you have high-level politics, so what Merkel is discussing today with Barbara May, and the low level of institutions and functionaries, which is the level where I work. What else? Here you can see the lobby expense, which is not the turnover, but is the amount of money spent on lobbying activities. There could be meetings, there could be preparation of position papers, there could be cocktail parties. And then you see that actually lobbying is very cheap in the EU. This is completely different from how it would be in US. In US, it's way more costly. Then you see on the left side who's lobbying the most. So interestingly, UK has been always very well represented in the EU, as much as the bigger countries. But here, immediately after Italy, you stop, because if you would go by size, I don't see Poland, which is a big country. There's a lot of United States, but it's also understandable because, well, everybody here has a Google account. And then you have information on MEPs, members of the European Parliament. And here you actually see the money. This is a very interesting case. This is actually common in many countries, but also here in the European Union, you see how much they get. That's a very interesting, a couple of very interesting stories. It's interesting that the first and the richest members of the European Parliament is actually a Lithuanian poker player. So yeah, fun facts. Or the second richest is Nigel Farage, so the driver of UKIP, of the Brexit movement. This is because of some broadcasting contract that he arranged with some UK companies that made him very rich. So yeah, as you see, there's a lot of information available, and that really makes a case for transparency. Now everything is transparent, there's a lot of accountability, and yet people don't care. Just a moment, I need to open my door just for a second.
Crazy, isn't it? Like,
Definitely.
yeah.
The lecture is on, and I'm just trying to understand how things move in European setup. Because lobbying in my country is not legal.
Okay, apologize. That was very rude. I had to open the door. Any question? No? Was I that clear?
I mean, we have questions. So, but I think you should finish the presentation, and then we can have a separate round of questions.
This will go on for some more. So if you have some burning questions, don't hesitate. If that helps your understanding of the whole.
No, we are. For me personally, I'm just trying to have a grasp of whole lobbying thing, which you are explaining in a very nice way. So I'm just trying to understand that.
Also, I really want to stress that all this information only exclusively relates to European Union. So,
oh yeah, definitely, yes. That's why I have more questions.
So these tools are relatively horizontals. They can be applied to national level, even municipal level, for what it matters.
Yeah.
In general, there are also some specificity that relates to the legal sector that you need to consider. Okay.
Sure.
So moving on, these are this toolkit. So these are the tools. These are the tools that make the job of a lobbyist, basically. So this is what literally this is what I do every day. So this is a module. This is a sort of a methodology that goes from an issue. You can take any issue that you want to solve in society, any issue you have a project on, and translate it into a political object. A political object that a politician or the law system could work with. And once you have that, you will be using avenues of participation. So these are the tools of the toolkit of a lobbyist. So for every particular policy domain, I could apply all these avenues, or what actually we do is we apply them all at the same time. So let me give you some examples. Before entering in the core of a campaign of any wish that you have in wanting to change society, you always need to go back to the law, and that actually that's the boring part. That when you need a lawyer, but basically it helps you understand how the policy system works. So let's imagine that you want to introduce, a plastic reduction in a particular country. You need to look at the process. You need to see if there are laws on a certain topics, whether a new idea was put into place, whether this is actually already a proposal already that is actually already implemented in a certain country, but maybe is not enforced correctly, or when a country has a certain political system that doesn't allow control over budgetary expenses. So this is because during the lobby process, your influence is dependent on the policy process. This takes the example of a normal political cycle, but shows on where, as a lobbyist, I'm more influential, where I have more lobbying power in order to be able to frame an issue in the way I want. Another common mistake is to take on the wrong competent authority. Europe is strong, but it's not totally strong. There are many tables explaining how the EU is more or less federal when compared to US. On certain aspects, on agriculture, for example, Europe is extremely federal. There is a very tight control on the work of every single farmers in the continent. Similarly, in the marine ecosystem, Europe is incredibly strong. There are officials that have to inspect every vessels that go out on fishing, and there are drones that control every fish stock in all the sea that are adjacent to European Union. However, in other things, Europe does nothing. When you have a problem in Syria or in Libya, Europe never acts. France, Germany, Italy do. When you consider health, Europe does nothing on health. There are just some cross-recognition systems so that if you're a doctor in Portugal, you can be a doctor in Germany. But there's nothing on price of medicine, insurance prices, orphan drugs, research, and so forth. Another thing is humanitarian aid. That's why we have so big of a mess in Europe when it comes to redistribution of migrants. This is simply because Europe has no power on migrants. We receive a lot of requests from human rights groups, and they want to meet the Commission, they want to discuss about the migrants, and that's fantastic, but it's not them. You are lobbying the wrong actor. So that also creates a case for understanding the law and who's to be lobbied. Then also you would consider your actors. Normally here I would, in the course of a workshop, I would show that, for example, NGOs never wants to consider unconventional partnerships. For example, the environment. We knew that the climate change is man-made, and we've been doing this for so long, and that we knew from the 70s. However, before the oil crisis in 74, or even before Chernobyl, there was no environmental awareness in Europe. So that prompted many NGOs to be very active in this field. However, now there are there's a lot of capacity in society on how to tackle that. States have ministries on the environment, so there is a lot of knowledge on the issue. So at this point, many NGOs should actually just cooperate with both states and companies, because they simply have more resources to focus on energy transition. But most of the time they don't, because in their map of positioning, they oppose change with those actors. Parts of our job as a lobbyist is to identify actors that might help you in your process. They may be embassies, they may be lawyers, they may be marketeers, they may be think tanks or universities. So we have a very diverse and vast array of allies that can be used in certain campaigns. So let me introduce some of these avenues. Normally, in this set of lecture, I usually refer to the tough parts, so to the legislative, administrative, and judicial part of the avenues. Why? Because people know what a campaign feels like. You've been asked by Greenpeace or by someone to donate for children's or environment, so you know what a campaign feels like. And you also know what policy feels like, because you see meetings and politicians. But what is interesting, or more interesting for an NGO, is to actually look at the legal part, because there's a lot of interesting tools that belong to the law that can make a very, very big difference in your campaign. And we're going to see a bunch of them. Legislative avenues. This is when you make a law. This is when you simply start a legislative proposal. A good example is petitioning. When you petition, you force your government to take into account what you want. Or this happens during revisions. So every 5 to 4 years, law has to be revisited. So this is a moment when legislation is accessible again. A good example would be, again, the petition system. Petition have a very different, they have many forms. Petition in Romania is different than petition in Portugal and so forth. But there are tools that are shared across the country, and the European Citizen Initiative is a good example of how you start a law. Another case is when you draft the law. So you have a set of experts that literally give it to the Commission, and the Commission starts working groups to understand which parts of that regulation to take in, and then you actually implement it, which from an NGO perspective, it's the best, because you're literally influencing social norms through implementation of law, which is a very impactful tool. Administrative tool. Administrative tools are my favorite because they are the fastest. To propose a law can take years. To sue someone, a dispute can take years. But administrative complaints are faster, so you get results faster. Here I will bring a few examples. The Freedom of Access of Information Act, the FOIA. The FOIA is a right. Basically, it's a constitutional right in many countries. Basically, citizens can get the documents. So if you don't like how Erdogan treated the migrants or Orban, just see the documents. Or if you don't like how Monsanto talks to the commission or Facebook talks to your government, get the document. I happen to be very knowledgeable of this tool, both because I used it a lot, but also because I received it a lot. So in a part of my job, I was working a lot with GMOs, so genetically modified organisms. And a lot of NGOs wanted to see what was our conversation with the commission. And they did. So they did a fantastic research that ended up being a 36 pages long dossier. And most of this information, as you can read, were obtained through Freedom of Information requests. So what happens? You send the Freedom of Information request. What do you get in return? Something like this. So you see the email conversation between us and the institutions. And that's actually true. Every couple of months, I would receive an email from the European Commission saying, Andrea, they want to see the emails. Can I publish this? And I would say, yes, of course, blank my names, bye. So this is a routine work. Interestingly enough, by opening the Pandora box, this NGO actually leaked information of my competitor. So this is, for example, a meeting of the European Seed Association that at the time was one of my competitors, and I knew what they talk about. You also get to see the actual document within institution parts. So these are, this is a head of unit that tells the other members of their team who was there, what happened, and so forth. Here you can recognize Bayer, for example. Or these are emails between a part of the institution that talks with another part of the institution. So this is DG Sante, so health, that speaks with DG Trade, commerce. And then also you get emails from stakeholders. So who else with you is lobbying for you? In this case was the Norwegian Board of Gene Technologies, for example. Then another tool, Olaf. European money are our money. So when they are not spent well, you can sue them. That's a very interesting case when Marine Le Pen, extreme right politician in France, was using European money to pay assistants that were not working as assistants. There was an easy political point to score, and this is where you want to use the Olaf power, the anti-fraud office. Again, this is boring bureaucracy, but it works. The Ombudsman. The Ombudsman is an institution. It comes from the Nordic law tradition. This is your representative. It's citizens' representative. The Ombudsman is the institutions that has the vocation to listen to what citizens have to say. And it's fun because basically the Ombudsman works for you. So every time you're not happy with how the institutions are working, you just complain. In my example, by working with the genetically modified organism debate, we complained to the Ombudsman that the European Commission was taking too long to decide. The European Commission took more than 7 years to take a position on this law, blocking commercial application. So that's a problem. So you can sue or you can notify to the Ombudsman that the Commission is working poorly. These are just some stats. In 2017, more than 15,000 people engaged with the Ombudsman. A good number of those actually became inquired that were open and that turned into official complaint and prosecution within institutions. And I think that's a very powerful tool. Legal challenge, that's my favorite. That's when you want to go full blown. This is when you have to interact with courts. But also implies a way of thinking of campaigning. You don't necessarily need to sue a company, but even a threat of a sue when stands on strong legal ground can be very strong. I'll give you an example. So this gentleman down here is Matteo Salvini, Minister of Interior in Italy. 2 summers ago, we had a spike in the arrivals of migrants in the Mediterranean. That prompted many NGOs to save them. Salvini destroyed this process. Salvini made his political career out of fear for migrants and migration. In this very specific case, the Nave Diciotti, the Diciotti ship from the army, from the Navy, so it's not an NGO ship, saved more than 170 lives in the Mediterranean and was bringing them to Sicily, safe in the harbor. When Salvini noticed that, he went blasting on social media, saying that they shouldn't ever be allowed to come in, that we should leave them there, to put them in quarantine. And so he basically stopped the ship from these people to outboard. At that point, it was chaos and crisis, and many NGOs went out in denouncing this behavior and that this is impossible, they should never be done, it's a clear violation of human rights. But they went on a several level of fight with the government. So Salvini used social media a lot, and NGOs were stupid enough to follow him on Twitter and Facebook. So that was just dragging on until one day, a judge from Sicily threatened Salvini to sue him for kidnapping, because you simply don't take people on hostage without no legal ground. The same day they were released. And I think that's a good example because, again, an NGO would normally feel more confident in the campaign field. So if you see something that you don't like, you go out and raise the awareness, which is fantastic, but depends on your resources. Sometimes NGOs come to me and they say, yes, we will make this document available and for everybody to see so that we will raise the awareness. Fantastic. What does it mean raising the awareness? Is it 1,000 people? You see 1 million people? You see 50 million people? How you raise awareness means money. And what are the tools you're using to reach them out? So if you have 20,000 euro and you have a big case to solve, an NGO would go 20,000 euro on Twitter. Whereas I would go 20,000 euro on a lawyer that will give me a fantastic strategy plan that will actually work. So then this is a clear example of how you can use those tools for your benefit. Now, questions so far?
So I have a question.
Yes.
So you have talked about lobbying and it's EU based, European Union based, but I am based out of India right now. So how do you connect lobbying in terms of global, conscious politics? We are trying to create ourselves with conscious politics. So what is the relation that we can establish of lobbying with conscious politics?
Conscious means aware.
Yeah.
And knowing the system normally, that's already a big step. So it implies that you have a certain level of knowledge of your environment. Because lobbying doesn't happen in a vacuum. Lobbying happens in certain places, and these are law and administration. So if you are aware of how this political level works, lobbying is nothing. Lobbying is just, what's the difference between lobbying and marketing? What is the level of engagement you have with your stakeholders? So lobbying is just a tool, and it adds up to the toolkit of the conscious politician, conscious consultant, the conscious civil society or social entrepreneurs. So that's the point, and that was point number one that I wanted to make. Lobby is just a tool. It's neither good or bad. It simply is. When applied in a certain way, create. I would normally start the lecture, asking yourself if you think that the Catholic Church lobbies, and they do a lot. In the institutions lobbying within themselves. I love to say that we lobby the Commission, but for example, in a specific dossier, I was introducing insect-based product in the legislation, and we said to our companies that we changed the law. But the reality is that a part of the Commission, DG Agri, so the Agricultural Ministry, wanted to use our data to counter-lobby the lobby coming from the Trade Ministry with the soy importers. So actually our information were used by the Commission to lobby within the Commission to push a certain regulation. City and regions lobby with and against each other everywhere at any point. So lobbying is just a level of communication of different fields. from municipal to national, regional, national, in this case European, and up to a certain extent international. Because you can move as far as the law and the enforcement of the law, those law allows you to. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. So moving forward, I want to understand uh, how lobbying can be used for social entrepreneurship, as you were saying. Like, I just want to understand through one example, if you can, provide me, where it has really made impact in terms of society. Obviously, you were citing about the whole environmental issue that has come up. So, is there any other example where I can just get a sense of lobbying as a positive means in terms of societal impact?
I can give you hundreds of examples depending on the field.
Yeah.
I happen to know a bit more food. A good example is the organic movement and the lobbying. So
Okay, for that matter, organic movement can work. So, can you just elaborate a bit on that, please?
So the subject of the lobbying exercise and the recipient of the lobbying exercise determine the lobbying exercise. Media and communication happens between two points. Lobbying, again, in and itself is an empty word, doesn't mean anything. The activities of Facebook in lobbying, the implementation of the regulation of data in Europe, it's a specific tag. The lobbying of German farmers that wants the Russia sanctions lifted because they want to sell product to them would be a lobby strategy. The activity of the city of Berlin in being awarded European Capital of Culture will be a lobbying exercise. So again, it's just a tool. If we twist the coin, then we see the civil society part. And then a good example is the gay movements and the LGBT movement since it started. So basically, it came out of the counterculture in the US in '68. And then he progressively grew and lobbied for the recognition of homosexuality. And many NGOs use legal tools to sue states, to European Court of Human Rights, for example, for the use or abuse of certain laws. And that's interesting because that has also been used on the other side. So, for example, in Croatia, a few years ago, the same sex, so for heterosexual marriage in the constitutions was introduced by NGOs. So Catholic NGOs use lobby tools to enforce anti-gay regulation. In the same ways, LGBT advocates would induce change in other countries. Poland is a good example. So countries that have been opening their regulation by conflict, by law conflicts. So yeah, it really depends on the fields. Usually Europe has a lot of tech lobbying, a lot of food lobbying, because Europe has this big internal market that has to be, where everything has to be the same. And so when it comes to goods and food goods, this is usually the case. So there's a lot of lobbying in food. For example, labeling. We have a lot of labeling things in Europe. And in particular, we have nutrient profiling. So every product has to tell you how much calories, fats, and carbs you have. But for example, it's a bottle of water. And any bottle of water you will find in Europe has a label somewhere that tells you that has, guess why, no proteins or carbohydrates and stuff. However, if you take a beer in the EU, you do not find the same thing. That's because that's in that specific legislation, the beer lobby did a fantastic job into keeping away certain spirits, and also wine and whiskeys are the same, out of the regulation. And now, 10 years after, they are coming back to society saying, actually, we do want to be labeled, because then we want our customers to know how the amount of calories you have for this product. So again, these are just tools. So you can describe lobbying in general. This is very general. But then when implemented in your project, follow a certain step. It's literally again, it's not rocket science. It's just a way of seeing things. So as a lobbyist, I will take any issue I have in front of me, from human rights to environment to rural development or educational systems. I will just take it from its legal point of view. and that's just very happens. It works. It simply works. Then you can raise society. Then you can raise awareness of certain issue. But that's a completely different thing. Policy making is emotional. I happen to work again a lot in this GMO field, genetically modified organism field, and there is a lot of emotional policy making. We have a lot of science used to be the benchmark of policy making. Now that's not the case. Take the anti-vaccine movement. So policy making is very emotional. So that's why you need to take other avenues to be actually able to improve.
What do you mean by this emotional policy making? Like, what has changed?
No, never. To me, politics is entertainment. To me, politics is Netflix. I'm not even joking. I'm only looking at the actual institutions and the law they produce, and everything else is just entertainment. Politics, especially now after the introduction of television and social media, it's way more showbiz. And that's why I don't care for that part, because that part...
I have a question as well, because I just stuck with some of your slides. Firstly, is that how would you differentiate the lobbying from the advocacy? Because now there things sometimes are very much confused, and some of the people prefer, instead of lobbying, use the word advocacy, but nothing changed their meaning. So that's my first question. The second one is basically, I was very, interested in the wording that mostly they were used by the lobbying organizations in their talks with the politicians and the bureaucrats. So I was very much surprised by your comment that migrants, that the issue, the challenge, and was not there. Yeah, this one. Thank you. So basically, humanitarian aid, migrants is definitely not there. So my question is why it's not there? Because the humanitarian business is one of the biggest, together with the pharmaceutical, by the way. So it's interesting enough for me. I see, of course, the digital market being there. So everything comes to be the digitalized, but still, I wonder what will be your answer to that. So is it also because of the emotions, but then it's doesn't duplicate sense?
So very well indeed. So starting from the second question, why is human rights not there? And then again, you go back to the law, and then you immediately realize that Europe has zero competence on human rights. Zero. That is always enforced at national level, and is always dependent by national courts. And that's the point of what is Europe competent on. Again, you mentioned pharma lobby. This is interesting. Pharmaceutical companies have a lot of money, and yet their power go up to a certain point. It's not in a situation where the more money, the more lobby. There's not an entrance. There is also a carrying capacity of the lobbying. This is why there's a lot of attention studies and agenda setting in politics. Meaning, if you have a meeting room with 10 people and you need to discuss a certain law, you just have a bunch of people in 1 hour. So if you talk for that 1 hour, you will not talk about other topics. In many of these European councils, or those meetings of high prime ministers in Europe, now there's a lot of Brexit, which means that they talk less about other stuff. So there is a carrying capacity of the institution. An institution can be lobbied up to a certain point. So pharma can't. For whatever the reason, pharma it will not be able to influence certain law. They have to go at member state level. We have a project now on medical cannabis, for example, so medical application of cannabis-based products. And we do a lot of national and regional lobbying even. Europe is not there. And then your first question, difference between advocacy and lobbying. I do use the two terms indistinctively. That has to do with the culture. So in Washington, D.C., a lobbyist from Greenpeace, he will call himself a lobbyist. Because of this bad connotation, they call it advocacy, call it whatever. It's always the same point. Lobbying wants to impact lawmaking. It wants to impact the law, straight. And that's actually the only difference between lobbying and marketing, because marketing is the same thing. Lobbying is a branch of corporate or government relations, which is communication. And that's why lobbying has changed so much, because communication tools have changed so much. And now you have social media, you have smartphones, you have information, you have transparency, you have data. Then how you use the data is a completely different discussion. But yeah, that has changed a lot.
Okay, help me understand one thing. So, it's a little bit silly question, but I would still like to ask from you. So, it is said that poverty is $1 billion industry. So, how does lobbying has created a whole, some net which has kept poverty as an industry vis-a-vis with NGOs who are working on poverty?
Can you repeat the question?
So my question is, no, it is said, poverty is $1 billion industry. So there was a whole documentary, Poverty Inc. So poverty has become industry. So there must be role of lobbyists and NGOs which are there working, So how this has happened? So can you just tell me like how the system works and why lobbyist or someone who is trying to advocate for the NGOs who are working on poverty or for that matter on any other humanitarian issue, and they are trying, and they are making profits out of that in my country or in some other places or might be in Africa. So this is what my question is, and I
Very
really
much
want to
connected
understand.
to my question as well.
Yeah, definitely. Just I'm trying to make it more explicit.
I think this question is fair, but goes well beyond this specific exercise, which is on European law.
Sure.
You are touching upon very serious issues, and they relate to geopolitics. It relates to redistribution of money. It also relates a lot with demographics. So this goes well beyond my field. So mine is just a wild guess, I'm obvious, but from the bottom of my heart, and with all due respect, I think the world is going just fine. If we check the Millennium Developmental Goals, we met them all. Obviously, the state of affairs is in a great urgency. I obviously recognize climate change, poverty, migration, the climate migrants, but comparatively to even 100 years ago, the world is doing sort of good. If you consider that less than 80 years ago, we were just killing the shit out of each other in wars, you see a big transformation. In the past 30 years, China went from nothing to the biggest and the richest country in the world by bringing literally 1 billion people from below poverty line of $1 a day to above poverty line of $10 a day, and actually the medium average keeps on growing. India also grew exponentially. When my dad was born in 1929, there were 1.5 billion people in the planet. My dad. And today it's 7.5, and we're going to 10 in 2050. So a lot of things has changed that has nothing to do with lobby. This has just had to do with how the works is going. I do see a role for states, but it's also, 100 years ago, states matter. India was UK was an empire by then. Now states exist, they're strong, but there are actors that are more powerful than states. So the Coca-Cola conglomerates manages more interaction than Peru. Companies are bigger than states. It's not randomly now space exploration is a private endeavor, simply because they have more money. Before, states were the only one with that amount of money, with that vocation. That has changed. That's why in many ways we're moving from being citizens as such to consumers of public services. In the US, the firemen, the policemen, the prison system is all private. It's all outsourced. In Europe, we have a strong statalist national tradition, so the states used to run a lot of stuff. In Eastern European countries, they have a completely different understanding of the bureaucratic system, the public administration system. So I do see a point for the fact that poverty as a business is a business like everything else. Comparatively to the situation of 50 or even a bit long, 50 years ago, I think we're super well. But now we have different challenges that have nothing to do with the challenges we had in the past, such as malnutrition or certain hygiene condition, but have to do with climate change, with instability. It's fair to say that there are no wars anymore. Yes, there are. I think at the point there are between 30 and 40 armed conflict active as we're speaking, but this is nothing compared to people in the world die of non-communicable disease. People in the world die of diabetes and cancer. In many countries, you have the double standards. So countries where, South Africa is a good example, where you have a very rich population and they die of diabetes and cancer, and a very poor population and they die of famine. So everything is a bit more scrambled now. Everything is a bit more paradoxical. It's less clear cut. So yeah, that doesn't answer nothing, but it's a contextual element to consider.
Definitely, I understand. Thank you.
Andrea, I have a short question. I didn't understand what's the nature from these administrative tools you mentioned. Is this institution from the government? Are these independent institutions, or how can I understand? And I didn't get it.
So yeah, administrative relates to things, how things work. It depends on the recipient of your lobby action. If you want to have more green in your city, you might address the city council. If you want to change the program of the school of your kid, you may address the region. If you want to lay incentives and workers for a plant, you engage with the states. So it depends on who's competent. That's the question on who are you addressing. Once you understand who you're addressing, you can speak administrative language. And you can ask and claim rights where the institutions are, they have to answer. It's funny, when I work on a certain project, as a lobbyist, the first things that I do when I don't know something, I just pick up the phone and I start dialing. And I call the European Commission, and they are there to answer my call. And I say, my name is Andrea, I represent this interest. I would like to know what are the legislative developments that will impact my client's activities. And the Commission has to answer because it's their job. Every day, my boss was calling the head of unit of the biotech technology, and she had to answer. And she wasn't pleased to answer, but she's a civil servant. So that's her job. So that's why administrative tools are interesting, because it allows you to speak with an interlocutor that has to answer in a certain ways. That's why you can get documents. More in general, it's more appropriate to have a constructive approach with institutions. So that's why they don't like NGO so much, because NGO point out certain issue that they sort of have the power to address, but not really. Because again, corporations are stronger than countries. So when civil society complains for certain Facebook behavior, yeah, you can complain to Belgium, you can complain to Morocco, you can complain from Ecuador, but that's a way bigger project. They're just bigger than you. So normally it helps to have a constructive approach with NGOs, with the institutions, so to see them as an ally, and to get information from them, and to give them information to get intelligence in return. So you create a trustworthy relations that you can always use to further your interest.
So you mean it's like I have to first use the administrative tools, and if they don't work, then I go to the judicial.
Yes.
That's the way, right?
Yes. Whatever you want to do, you always first study the law. Every project we run starts with a legislative overview. Maybe I have one here. So this is private documents, but I can just show. That's a project by which we are checking the laws that impact a specific sector. This is the fruit juice sectors in Europe, and these are all just information. These are all regulation, and how this regulation relates to a certain number of stakeholders. So who acts in a certain law, and what's their position and the impact on a certain regulation. So this is step one. So once you know the regulatory environment, you know who's acting on it, you know what's the length of this process, what are the deadlines, you know when to lobby, you know who to lobby. If there is something that that an institution is dealing with, there will be someone in charge of that. So if you want to act on plastic, there will be Mr. Plastic in the European Commission, or Mr. Human Rights in Ghana. So you talk to that person. So once you have the regulatory overview, Then you understand who's acting, so you do your stakeholder mapping, and then you can develop policy objective. And then you say, in order to achieve this goal, I would rather start a petition while running a campaign. In another case, you might want to solve migrants' asylum seeker practice on a certain tribunal, so you will go judicial, and perhaps you will add some political element by needing legislation. When I was working for the GMO sector, I was running a campaign, but I was also a petition for that law to be changed while I was sending a complaint to the ombudsman, while I was following a judicial development, while I was meeting with actual politicians. So in my daily job, I use them all. I use campaign tools because I have a website, because I have an email address. This is a campaigning tool. I always look at public consultation. So every time European law changes, the institution asks people to give feedback. So this is consultation with the public. Then you can lobby a lot. As I said, I love administrative complaint because they allow me to speak directly with institutions, and they work very well. Judicial is the ones I have less experience with because once you follow a legislative procedure, it takes ages. So either you start because you know you're gonna end it up, or there's a sort of handover, so you know how long it will take, or you don't use it. But again, sometimes it's just sufficient to know the law and threaten an institution of a judicial procedure because nobody wants to go in a legal fight anymore. And then political tools. Here we would also include tools of open editorials, op-eds, so articles in newspapers where you address a politician, or when you address. Actually, this is way easier with communication tools now because you actually have politicians on Twitter, so you can very much address them directly, whatever that would then imply. Every time I use the word politician, I think functional. So I will never send messages to actual politician in my country. No, but this is the show business. When I'm talking to someone, it's usually functionaries, civil servants, those who don't change every 5 years. Okay, so that brings me to the final part of this presentation, and it's the following. So, not too much. Imagine you have your project, imagine you want to do something, imagine you want to apply those techniques. What do? Again, I couldn't stress this further than this. The first thing, you always get a lawyer. The level of legal quality that your exercise requires might be knocked out in an afternoon if a good lawyer sets on it. This might also be people, these are companies, and companies are big things. But at the end of the day, you will see that a lot of lawyers are people, and they just like to follow the mission or the arguments they're more interested in. In Czech Republic, we were working with Dentons, which is actually the biggest law firm in the world, and the pro bono lawyer was a strong advocate for LGBT rights in Czech Republic. She then eventually started up her own NGO, simply because she was so thoroughly knowledgeable of this topic that she actually drafted a constitutional amendments to put it in. So this is high quality job from an expert that could have been done everything else with his time, but she was just extremely passionate. So, by looking for your friendly lawyers, might actually find someone that really cares about that mission or that cause. So why not to try? Then also you can explore lobbyist networks. The Good Lobby is a good example. There's many more. There's the PILNet, which is a huge network of pro bono professionals. Access Info is an NGO that helps NGO to do freedom of access of information requests. So that also helps. And then just some thoughts on the way. What I tried to do today was to add a layer of complexity, to add a strategic an envelope around your project. So you don't just want to achieve something with your project. You might also want to understand the environments around this project. That's a strategic way of thinking. It makes a difference. And in order to achieve that, you need to have a clear regulatory legal understanding of your issue. Again, you don't need to be an expert. You can just call one. And that brings to the second point, which is you need to speak administrative lingo. You need to speak the same language. Again, you don't need to be a lawyer. You can talk to one. You can understand how a certain procedures goes on, and you could act as a center, as a hub for connecting other kind of professionals. I know about GMO, fantastic, but I am not a biotechnician. I have no idea. But that's not my point. I can talk with one. At the same time, I can talk to a professor, I can talk with the students, I can talk with a politician, I can talk with a functionary, I can talk with an NGO, I can talk with a think tank, I can talk with a university. So my job is to speak many languages so that they can all understand. But having the legal understanding is the basis. And last but not least, it's always good to be an informed citizen and a critical thinker. That's your role as an informed and responsible person. But also keep being critical all the way. So grassroots is cool except when it isn't. My experience in politics comes from the Five Star Movement. They're the populist group in Italy. The politician I was working with in the parliament was from that party. And they are a textbook example of a grassroots movement. They started 7 years ago with spontaneous meetings in many cities in Italy. They grew up as a political force. In a matter of 3 years, they had parliamentary representation. In 5 years, they were the second biggest party in the country. And now they're ruling the country. They are in the government coalition with the extreme right. They suck. They always sucked, but in this specific case, sucked even more. And that's a very common example in many European political landscape. You see the traditional parties being trashed over and new parties coming in. You see it in everything. From Spain to Finland, new parties came in. They're mostly on the right, but not necessarily. So yeah, grassroots is cool. The Gilets jaunes movement, the yellow vest movement in Paris is fantastic, but actually not. Okay, yes, have those people and transparent, inclusive debates. But even when you have so, Brexit happens. So fuck-ups happens. And that has to do also with the policy, emotional policy making. The Brexit campaign was based on playing lies and people didn't even bother to fucking check. So that's it. It's to me, it's absolutely normal. There's nothing wrong with it. Politics has always been like that. I love when my mom complains about politics nowadays, but then my question is, when has ever been good? Politics starts as a compromise. Politics is the art of bargaining. So it has to mathematically left someone discontent with the decision. So I think by now I stress those 3 points. We will repeat because that's the way it goes. So by now you might figure that lobbying is actually an empty word. It's just an empty box. Put it whatever you want. Call it advocacy, whatever you want. It's just a tool. And this tool is made of a way of thinking that relates mostly to the regulation, but not also. However, yes, the legal part is important. So if I do apologize for the repetition, my only role here is to make sure that you nail the importance of law. So whatever things you start, whatever debate you're starting, go to the law check, do your homework, and then you actually see where you can intervene. And that actually it's actually very powerful. I'll give a stupid example. I took a flight a few weeks ago from Warsaw. It was delayed of more than 3 hours. And I know that there is a European passengers' right directive that says that I have right to compensation. So I tried, and I started by sending an email to the air providers, the service provider. They didn't reply. I sent an email to the competent authority of the Polish system. They didn't reply. Now I can actually send it to the European Court. Linear. I know what my rights are. So from very little, stupid, mundane problems to bigger societal challenges, knowing the law allows you to interact with the system.
Andre, can you emphasize on the third point, please? How citizen lobbyists make better policy making? So how this is ensured?
Well, because you know what happens. If you know where to find the income of your politicians, you hold them accountable. If you know that a certain region is responsible for air quality in a city, you can nail them down and you can expose them to their responsibility. If you give me an example, I don't know, give me a problem that torments you apart from poverty, give me something more handable.
I mean, air pollution is a problem in my country.
Plastic. Air pollution has tremendous commercial implication, which allows social entrepreneurs to use basic economic incentives. In Europe, we have the carbon tax. In Europe, we have the emission trading schemes, which is bullshit and can definitely be improved. But it is a tool, and you can sit on that tool to make it more mandatory, to make mandatory quotas for countries or companies to stick to. And that actually already happens in some specific cases, Norway, Denmark. But you can hold them accountable on economic principles. So you tax them or you give them incentives. So in general, climate change is a marketing issue. So you just need to force corporations to pay more. But at the same time, and here the emotional paradox comes in, people don't want to pay for it. So a very interesting example is the big debates run by Macron in France. Every of these debates came with the idea that environment is an urgency. And 80% of the same said that they will not be happy to pay more taxes to, the electricity to come from renewable sources or planes. I mean, Sweden is going diesel car free by 2030. Fantastic. How about your planes? So, and environmental conditions are very much impacted by consumer choices, and that has nothing to do with lobby. How to tell people to eat less beef and burgers. This is something that NGOs can do. There was a very interesting documentary that I don't remember what was the name. It was the one with DiCaprio saying, it was on Netflix, explaining how easy it is for environmental NGOs to point at that power plant, to point at that nuclear waste, but they can't say, dude, eat less meat, because, chicken consumption goes crazy and agricultural supply chain accounts for more than 25% of the CO2 emission. Or, they can't say, dude, don't take a flight, take a train, because people wouldn't simply do it. So, in this specific case, NGOs have a lot of leverage on legal tools, because you can sue companies that pollute. That has happened over and over in the years. Not everywhere, not with the same depth, but this is a system that works. Take oil spills. When oil spills in oceans, that always a big fuck up, and companies never pay as much as damages are, but they do pay. That would have been impossible even 80 years ago. So yeah, again, I think things are okay. They could go definitely better, but considering what we started, it's good we haven't killed each other in the past few nuclear Cold War threats at the same before that. Any question?
Well, thank you.
If any question applies, then I'll definitely ask for the 5-star movement. That will be absolutely my choice of it. The thing is that you said that now 5-star movement basically sucks to quote you correctly, so, and I mean, I don't want to go more into the details, but we are waiting for the European parliamentary elections, and in such a sense, like emotional politics again come on the stage, and they will continue, particularly now in May. We see a lot of, kind of tensions, and then a lot of the chaos happening in the news, and there are a lot of messages being, kind of implicated to what one politician or another, what one party or another is doing. So how do you see the emotional policy making, and whether it implies for the lobbyist activists now in order to prepare for more seats in the European Parliament?
There's different layers to this question. So the Italian dimension, this is domestic politics. How they relate to Europe, being a big presence in Europe, because they have a big number of members of European parliaments there, and how social media interact with this popularity. These are different items. From the last one, fake news are real. and they do have power. It has been proved from Brexit to Trump election to the Rohingya persecution in Myanmar. That's a fact. And by the time Facebook got better at it, fuck up happened. And the same system of information that was used in Brexit was the same that helped the Trump election. So that creates disturbance. On top of it, 5 stars happen to be extremely social media oriented. As a matter of fact, they were the first one to introduce political ideas that were brought by the Pirate Party in Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. So absolute freedom of information online, absolute platform for democracy, e-democracy, everyone should vote from his laptop. So they introduced that. And also the political context in which they were in, which is 20 years of Berlusconi. So after 20 years of Berlusconi, it was also physiological for the country to come up with some sort of direct democracy system. So we also, in a way, anticipated what has happened in many other European countries, from Ciudadanos and Podemos in Spain to Macron in France, even with the Lib Dem in UK. And then we were so rapid in having them in that we immediately realized how much they suck, because they do. And that has nothing to do with political affiliation. They are simply incompetent. I can speak from my own experience, and the politician I was working with, she was extremely incompetent. Now, 5 years has passed. She might have now become an expert. I'm absolutely that sure that she took her job seriously. But the way she started, and as a politician, she was just terrible. So she was a victim and a puppet of everyone else. The assistant that was telling her what to say, whom to talk to. So unfortunately, politics is an actual job and requires actual political skills. You can't just improvise. Yes, emotional policy making comes in with gay rights, weapons rights, environmental rights. So you do have that, but much of politics goes below the radar because who fucking cares? Of all the laws that are passed, the European Commission has a legislative output of 900 pieces, which means that every year the Commission kicks out 900 laws. How many do you know about? How many do I work with? In my job, if I'm very busy, I will be working with 10 legislation, perhaps. But the rest is just bureaucracy going on. The rest is just the normal routine work of an administration to keep up. So this is why lobby and politics acts on very little issues of what the machine is actually about. You're not aware of your body breathing. You can influence your breathing, but it goes on its own. You are not always aware of what are the sanction or the procedure behind public procurement in sanitation. So these are just law that keeps on. The rest is the show business. The rest is what you see on social media and television, and that doesn't add to the discussion. And again, 5 stars are also guilty of being fake news distributors at all points. They were behind the anti-vaccine movement in Italy. And that's something that hits me particularly because everything we do is science-based. I know it sounds trivial. And this goes against plain understanding of science. And, it actually creates public health issues on a longer run. So no, I'm disillusioned because again, I also started believing that I was new, it was interesting. And I wanted to try with my own experience, and I did, and I loved it because, of course, it helped. It helped me understand how a politician thinks, what's the process behind. But I need to be honest, they suck. So, would you rather have a corrupt politician or a politician that has no idea of his job? So, again, politics is a bargaining experiment. So, you need to raise people that are proficient in their job and that are able to understand the reality of that system. So yeah, that's a very personal story. Doesn't necessarily have to relate with other political parties. They happen to be new in our political system. As a matter of fact, in any political system, there are no other.
I was asking this question is basically we have a copy paste now in Ukraine because the comedian comes to be the president, right? In our country. So
But this is fun, but not unsurprising. Since
Yeah,
television,
that's the point. No one is laughing now, like before we laugh, now no one
take
is
it this
laughing.
way. From when television started to be important for politics, actors started to become, Ronald Reagan or Schwarzenegger. So the fact that an actor actually is a very well-suited politician. That doesn't necessarily. But even when you have a doctor as a politician, Lithuania had a prime minister. He was a heart surgeon. Andrew Kaitis, fantastic. He's a doctor. He knows nothing of mobility. He knows nothing of nuclear power. So even if you are a professional in your field, you still have no clue about the complexity of how the machine works anyway. So you never talk about a specific, okay, yeah, a person helps because you see Trump there. So you address a state with that is just a the concept of state is fantasy. So you need to address it. You need to give it an eye and a face. But how that relates to the machine, I mean, so the president can or cannot be there. It wouldn't change a damn. Obama was a revolutionary, introduced a lot of change in politics, especially in the US. That didn't stop him to increase military spending as usual, to allow a lot of military operation conducted mostly with drones and open new war scenarios in case of necessity. That's simply how the state works with or without any of its presidents. That's national security. So again, president is here, is high politics. We work here. We work with people that don't turn every 5 years. We work with functionaries and civil servants. Very well. So then again, I thank you for your time and for this little journey into a fairy tale, which is politics. And start to follow us on social media and on our activities and in the website, so The Good Lobby. And good luck with your path and with your adventure. So professionally or not, feel free to contact and to keep in touch. I would love to be your sparring partner in your project on your ideas, and you know where to find me.
Thank you, Andrea. You've been already helpful so much in our group. You are a member of our group, and I can really assure also Christina has been in touch with you.
Yeah.
So she's already
I will write to you again. I learned a lot today. Thank you very much, Andrea. But I will write to you. I have many questions, but there are two specifically.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. It was really fun, to listen to something that, even not we are not in the EU, so still there are kind of the common sense of understanding how the citizen lobbying, actually advocacy, is working. It's what we prefer in Ukraine.
Happily. And I will be in Ukraine the 11th of July to give a workshop on good lobby stuff. And this is done the pro bono platform, Ukrainian pro bono platform, and the Aspen Institute. So we can already...
Yeah. I'm a part of Aspen Youth Institute because there are two levels.
I think I'll meet you very soon.
Okay, with a great pleasure.
Very well.
Thank you, Andrea. For me, it was, you were brutally real. So I enjoyed every bit of thing which you said, and it was whole set of new learning for me. And definitely, I will try to put some questions to you whenever some doubts arise to me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Have a nice evening, night, day, afternoon.
Andrea, do you want to say something?
No, I just want to say thank you, and I apologize for being late. I just joined you guys for the last 20 minutes, but it was very interesting. I'm looking forward to see the whole recording and the video from the lecture. So definitely, we'll review it. So yeah, thanks a lot for your time, Andrea.
Yes.
Thank you, Andrea. Have everyone great rest of your day, night, evening, and yes, and see you very. Oh yeah, there's no screen. I was like, who disappeared? Just your presentation. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Andrea, for everything. And yeah, let's work it out because lobbying is a part of our lives. So
thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot. And see you. Bye bye.